The piercing sound of the alarm clock cut through the silence of the small apartment at 4:30 a.m. Jake Mac McAllister didn't actually need it. He'd been awake for hours, his eyes fixed on the cracked stucco ceiling where a water stain grew bigger with each rare L.A. downpour, just like his debts. He sat on the edge of the bed, his muscles protesting after another poorly slept night. The bathroom mirror revealed a 45-year-old man who looked closer to 60, with premature gray hair, deep dark circles, and wrinkles that hadn't existed 2 years ago, back when Sarah was still alive. "Today is going to be different," he muttered to his reflection, repeating the daily mantra that had become just another lie he told himself. His fingers brushed against the wedding band he still wore, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he still had to pay for. Breakfast was always the same, stale bread and instant coffee. As he chewed mechanically, his eyes scanned the pile of bills on the kitchen table. On top, in red letters that seemed to shout, was the eviction notice. Final warning. Deadline 72 hours. Mac closed his eyes, but the words remained there, burned into his retina like the neon sign reading Liberty Cab Co., waiting for him outside. 3 days, 72 hours, to come up with $5,000 in overdue rent, or he'd be out on the street. "You should have sold the cab when I suggested it, Mac," Sarah's voice echoed in his memory from a conversation 3 years earlier. "We could have used the money for the treatment." "And what would I live on afterward?" he had replied, holding her hand in the hospital bed. "No, my love, I'll get a loan, you'll see. Everything will work out." But it didn't. The loan came with astronomical interest, the experimental treatment failed, and now he was buried in debts that grew like the stain on the ceiling. He grabbed the keys to his taxi, a 2015 Crown Victoria that had seen better days, and went down the building stairs, avoiding the elevator that had been broken for months. On the ground floor, Mrs. Higgins, the building manager, was waiting for him like a vulture. "Mr. McAllister," she began, her tone falsely sweet, "about the rent." "3 days, Mrs. Higgins, I know," he cut her off, continuing on his way without stopping. The building's garage smelled of mold and desperation. His taxi, once white, now had a yellowish tint no car wash could remove. When he turned the key, the engine coughed 3 times before starting, yet another thing in need of repair he couldn't afford. The city was just waking up under a sky heavy with dark clouds. On the radio, the weatherman announced a cold front approaching, with forecasts of heavy rain and fog for the night. Mac cursed under his breath. Nights like that meant fewer fares, more cautious drivers, and empty streets. At the Speedy Mart gas station, his credit card was declined twice before finally going through on the 3rd attempt. "Credit limits almost maxed out," Mac warned Tony, the attendant who had known him for years. "Careful not to get stranded out there." The first drops of rain began to fall as he parked at the taxi stand. He was one of the few drivers still holding out there. Most had switched to rideshare apps, but Mac refused. "Those apps are the death of traditional cab driving," he often said, though he knew his stubbornness was costing him dearly. As he waited for his first customers of the day, his mind wandered to the dresser drawer at home where he kept the wedding album. In every photo, Sarah was smiling, her green eyes shining with the promise of a future now lost forever. The taxi dispatch radio crackled. "Attention all units, forecast calls for heavy fog tonight. Traffic will be restricted on Mulholland Drive. Repeating." Mac looked at the sky through the smudged windshield. The clouds were getting darker, just like his prospects for the future. His fingers drummed on the worn steering wheel, calculating mentally. He needed at least 15 good rides to cover part of the rent. With weather like this, it would be a miracle to get 5. His phone vibrated, another overdue bill on the cracked screen. His banking app showed his balance, $47.23, not even enough for a full tank of gas. A stronger gust of wind rocked the car, bringing more rain and the memory of his last conversation with Sarah. "Promise you'll move on," she had pleaded, her voice already weak. "Promise you'll take care of yourself." "I promise," he had lied, holding her hand until her final breath. Now, 2 years later, the only path he seemed to follow was the road to complete ruin. The taxi, once his livelihood, had turned into an anchor dragging him down, but it was also his last link to his former life, to years of honest work alongside Sarah. The rain intensified, turning the city into a gray blur through the windshield. Mac turned the wipers on full speed, watching the droplets get swept back and forth like his last glimmers of hope. "I just need one chance," he murmured to himself, eyes fixed on the ever-emptier street. Just one chance to turn this around. What he didn't know was that this chance was about to appear, wrapped in fog and flames, bringing far more than he could imagine. But for now, all Mac could do was wait, trapped between his past losses and an uncertain future. As the storm approached, the radio crackled again, this time more urgently. "Attention all units. Visibility is worsening in the Mulholland Drive area. Drivers proceed with extra caution." Mac adjusted the rearview mirror, staring into his own weary eyes. Somewhere in the city, amid the falling rain, his destiny was about to change drastically. But at that moment, he was just another cab driver on the brink, counting the minutes and the raindrops, hoping for a fare that might save his day or his life. Night had already swallowed the city when the dispatch radio finally crackled with something other than fog warnings. Mac was almost dozing off, lulled by the monotonous sound of rain on the taxi roof. "Unit 247. Mac, we have a ride for you." He straightened up in his seat, suddenly alert. It was the voice of Brenda, the night shift dispatcher. "Go ahead, Brenda. I'm listening. Fare to the Mulholland Drive area. The client wants to go to the Sterling Estate." Mac frowned. Sterling Estate was a luxury compound almost 25 miles out of town, across the fog-covered mountain roads. On a normal night, he would have refused right away. But this was no normal night. "Brenda, visibility is terrible on those roads. Are you sure there's no one closer?" "Negative. I've tried all units in the area. The client's willing to pay extra because of the weather." Mac looked at the crumpled eviction notice on the passenger seat. 3 days. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. "Give me the address." 10 minutes later, he stopped in front of a downtown bar. A man in a soaked suit got in quickly, carrying a briefcase. "Sterling Estate," the man said curtly, already on the phone, "and please make it fast. I've got an important meeting tomorrow morning." Mac nodded, putting the car into gear. The wet streets reflected the city lights like a broken mirror. As they headed toward Mulholland Drive, buildings gave way to trees that thrashed violently in the wind. The passenger kept talking on the phone, his voice a tense murmur in the back seat. Mac's eyes remained on the road, which grew more treacherous by the minute. The fog descended like a white shroud, swallowing the taxi's headlights. Then the lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, they were just two bright dots cutting through the fog, but they were coming up fast, too fast for these conditions. Mac adjusted the mirror, watching a sleek black sports car weaving along the winding road. "Crazy fool," he muttered, keeping his cautious pace. The sports car passed them like a black phantom, its engine roaring in the night. For an instant, Mac glimpsed the illuminated interior, one driver and what looked like two small silhouettes in the back seat. "That one's going to kill himself at that speed," he thought, and had barely finished that thought when he saw the car's brake lights flare in the distance. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The sports car skidded on a curve, its tires losing grip on the wet asphalt. Like a macabre dance, the vehicle spun, slammed into the guardrail, and in a moment of terrible suspension began to flip. My God! Mac slammed on the brakes, the taxi skidding to a stop. What happened? His passenger finally hung up, alarmed. A bad wreck. Mac was already opening the door. Stay here and call for help. The rain hit him like icy needles as he jumped out of the taxi. The sports car had stopped rolling and now lay on its side, about 150 feet ahead. Then Mac saw something that made his blood run cold, sparks flying from the crumpled engine. No, no, no. He ran down the slippery road, almost falling twice. The smell of gasoline and burnt rubber cut through the damp air. The sparks were turning into small flames, licking the front of the vehicle. As he got closer, Mac heard something that made his heart stop. A child crying. "Hang on!" he yelled, reaching the driver's window. The glass was shattered, revealing the car's luxurious interior. The driver was motionless, pinned by his seatbelt, blood streaming from a deep cut on his forehead. Mac checked his pulse. Nothing. The crying came again, weaker this time, from the back seat. Twisting to peer through the broken glass, Mac saw something that froze his spine. 2 child safety seats, and in them 2 identical little girls, no older than 4. One of them was moving feebly, tears creating trails on her grimy face. The other was alarmingly still. The fire was spreading faster now, fed by leaking gasoline. Mac tried the door handle. Locked. He tried breaking the rear window with his elbow, but it was bulletproof glass. "Help?" The child's voice was almost a whisper. "Hang on, sweetheart. I'm getting you out." The heat was intensifying. Smoke was starting to seep into the car through the mangled hood. Mac ran back to the taxi, stumbling in the darkness. "There are kids in that car?" he shouted to his passenger, who was still on the phone with 911. "I need something to break the glass." The man opened his briefcase frantically, rummaging. Here, he pulled out a solid metal paperweight. "Will this do?" Mac grabbed it and sprinted back to the burning car. Flames now covered the entire hood, dancing dangerously close to the windshield. With all his strength, he hammered the rear window. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, he finally managed to smash a hole big enough. Smoke was thick inside the car. The 2 girls coughed weakly, their tiny hands grasping the seat belts. Mac squeezed through the hole, ignoring the shards of glass slicing into his arms. "I'm getting you out," he said, fumbling with the first seat belt. The conscious girl stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily," she whispered between coughs. "Okay, Lily, hold on tight around my neck." With a click, the belt came free. Mac lifted Lily in his arms and carefully passed her through the shattered glass to his passenger, who stood ready to receive her. "My sister!" Lily cried as soon as she was safe. "Violet." Mac was already back inside the car, wrestling with the second belt. Violet was starting to stir, coughing in the increasingly thick smoke. A loud popping noise came from the engine. Mac knew what it meant. He had only seconds before the explosion. "I'm not leaving you here," he muttered, finally managing to undo the second belt. He scooped Violet into his arms and contorted himself back toward the opening. That was when he felt the heat at his back. With a deafening roar, the fuel tank exploded. Mac hurled himself out of the car, shielding Violet with his body, rolling across the wet asphalt as a fireball consumed what was left of the vehicle. For a moment, all he could hear was the crackling of flames and the ragged sound of his own breathing. Then other sounds returned. Lily's cries, distant sirens, the rain still pouring down. "Violet?" he asked softly, looking down at the girl in his arms. She coughed and opened her eyes, the same green as her sister's. "It hurts," she murmured. "I know, sweetheart, but you'll be okay. You both will." Mac sat on the wet asphalt, holding a twin in each arm, watching the flames devour the remains of the luxury car. Only then did he notice the gashes in his arms, blood mixing with rain. The sirens were much closer now. Lily had stopped crying and was holding her sister's hand, both of them trembling against Mac's chest. He took off his soaked jacket and covered the girls as best he could. "Mac," his passenger ran up to them. "An ambulance is on the way. Are you all right?" He nodded mechanically, his eyes fixed on the 2 little lives in his arms. Something inside him, something that had died with Sarah, seemed to have awakened. "Don't leave us," Lily whispered, her small fingers gripping Mac's shirt. "I won't," he promised, and this time it wasn't a lie. The red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles began to cut through the fog. Mac knew his night was far from over, that there would be questions, reports to file. He also knew he had just gotten himself into something far bigger than a routine ride. But at that moment, sitting on the wet asphalt with two frightened children in his arms, all that mattered was that he had made the right choice. For the first time in 2 years, ever since he lost Sarah, Mac felt he was exactly where he needed to be. The fog was starting to lift, revealing the first lights of the approaching ambulance. A new story was about to begin, born from the flames of an accident on a night that was supposed to be just another in his failed life as a broke taxi driver. And as the sirens drew closer, Mac held the two girls tightly, knowing that somehow this wasn't the end of a terrible night, but the start of something new, something that would change his life forever. Cedars Sinai Medical Center was a towering structure of glass and steel against the still dark early morning sky. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the air remained heavy and damp. In the ER entrance, fluorescent lights created a surreal glow that made raindrops look like floating diamonds. Mac sat in an uncomfortable chair in the waiting area, his clothes still damp from the rain, stained with soot and blood. The smell of burning seemed to cling to his skin, mixing with the antiseptic odor so typical of hospitals. His arms stung under the makeshift bandages a nurse had applied as soon as they arrived, but he barely felt the physical pain. His thoughts were on the double doors through which the twins had disappeared, surrounded by a medical team speaking technical terms he didn't understand. Lily had not wanted to let go of his hand. It took 5 minutes of gentle promises from a gray-haired nurse, assuring them he could see them again soon, before the girls finally allowed themselves to be taken in for examination. The taxi passenger, Mac hadn't even asked his name, had left after giving an initial statement to the police, though not without pressing his business card into Mac's hand and thanking him repeatedly for what he had done. The card was now crumpled in his pocket, alongside the eviction notice that felt like it had come from another lifetime. A young nurse approached, holding out a cup of coffee to Mac. "You look like you need this," she said kindly. "I'm Clara. I'm helping with the twins." Mac took the coffee with a nod of gratitude. "How are they?" "Stable. Some cuts and bruises, smoke inhalation, but considering the accident, it's a miracle." Clara hesitated a moment. "They keep asking for you." Mac felt something tighten in his chest. It was strange how in just a few hours those two little girls had become so important to him. Maybe it was the way Lily looked at him when he pulled her from the car, or how Violet clung to him during the explosion. Something about them awakened a protective instinct he thought had died with Sarah. "Mr. McAllister?" Mac looked up. 2 police officers stood before him, a senior man with graying hair and a commanding stance, and a young woman with keen eyes and a serious expression. "I'm Detective Miller, and this is Detective Davies," the man introduced himself, showing a badge. "We need to ask you some questions about the accident." Mac nodded mechanically. He'd expected this ever since the first squad cars arrived. Clara, the nurse, threw him a worried glance before stepping away. "Could you accompany us to that room over there?" Detective Davies indicated a small meeting room at the end of the corridor. The room was even more sterile than the rest of the hospital, if that was possible. A rectangular table occupied the center, surrounded by plastic chairs that looked uncomfortable at first glance. Mac sat down, feeling every muscle in his body protest. The detective sat on the other side of the table, and Miller pulled a small recorder from his pocket. "For the record," he explained, turning it on. "Mr. McAllister, could you tell us exactly what happened tonight?" Mac took a deep breath, the taste of smoke still lingering in his throat. "I was at the downtown taxi stand near the main square. It was around 11:45 p.m. when I got a call from dispatch." He recounted the night's events: the reluctant acceptance of the fare, the hurried passenger, the speeding car cutting through the fog. His voice cracked slightly as he described finding the girls in the back seat, the fire creeping closer, the desperation of not being able to open the doors. "What about the driver?" Miller asked, jotting notes in a worn pad. Did you try to help him too?" He was already dead when I got to the car. Mac closed his eyes for a moment, reliving the scene. I checked his pulse, but there was nothing I could do. Interesting. Detective Davies leaned forward, her eyes studying Mac's every reaction. "So you're a taxi driver who just happened to be passing by at that exact moment, on that remote road, on a foggy night?" The tone made Mac straighten in his chair, a familiar surge of irritation rising in his chest. "Yes, like I said, I was taking a passenger to the Sterling estate. This passenger," Miller checked his notes, "has already given a statement, but we still have some inconsistencies to clear up." "What inconsistencies?" "The crashed car," Davies continued, her voice professional but with an edge of suspicion, "belonged to Richard Sterling. Does that name mean anything to you?" Mac shook his head, though something in the detective's manner suggested it should. "Richard Sterling is one of the wealthiest men in the country," she explained, watching his reaction carefully. "Those little girls you saved are his daughters. And the deceased driver was David Johnson, his personal head of security for over 10 years. "And?" Mac asked, starting to see where this was going. "We find it very convenient that a taxi happened to be right there at that moment, on that specific road," Miller added, his tone gentler than his partner's, but no less probing, especially considering that route isn't common for cabs, particularly on a night like this. Mac felt a wave of anger surge inside him. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with the accident?" "We're just doing our job, Mr. McAllister," Davies replied coolly, pulling a folder from her bag. "Your financial history shows you're in a rather desperate situation. Mounting debts, unpaid loans, an eviction notice. How did you—" "It's our job, Mr. McAllister," Miller interrupted gently. "We have to explore every angle, and you have to admit, your financial struggles combined with the circumstances of this accident. So you think I, caused the crash somehow, then risked my own life to save the girls?" Mac held up his injured arms, the bandages still stained with blood. "What kind of brilliant plan would that be?" "We've seen more elaborate schemes," Davies commented. "Maybe you planned to play hero, expecting a generous reward from a grateful father." Mac stood up so abruptly that his chair toppled over. "You're telling me I orchestrated an accident that killed a man and almost killed 2 children for money? The door to the room burst open, cutting off his furious outburst. A tall man in his 40s, wearing a suit that, despite being rumpled, exuded wealth and power, stormed in. His piercing blue eyes swept the room, a mixture of fear and fury etched on his aristocratic face. "Where are my daughters?" His voice was deep and authoritative, the kind used to giving orders and being obeyed. "Mr. Sterling," Miller stood up quickly, his tone shifting to something more respectful. "Your daughters are being treated. The doctors—" "And who are you?" Sterling turned to Mac, his eyes blazing with an intensity that would intimidate weaker men. "This is Jake McAllister," Davies began. "He was—" "I saved your daughters," Mac interrupted, meeting the billionaire's gaze. Something about the man's arrogance, combined with the detective's accusations, had ignited his natural stubbornness. "And if you'll excuse me, I promised them I'd be around when they woke up." He moved toward the door, ignoring the detective's protests. Sterling blocked his path, his physical presence as imposing as his aura of authority. "My driver, a man who worked for me for 10 years, is dead," he said in a low voice, each word laced with a veiled threat. "My daughters almost died. If I find out you had anything to do with it—" "Mac!" The childish cry sliced through the tension in the room like a sunbeam cutting through storm clouds. Lily stood in the doorway, still in a pale green hospital gown, her blonde hair disheveled, a bandage on her forehead. Clara, the nurse, was right behind her, clearly upset she hadn't been able to stop the little girl from running off. "Lily," Sterling turned, his arms automatically extending toward his daughter, but the child ran straight to Mac, hugging his legs tight. "You promised you wouldn't leave," she said, her voice thick with tears she was trying to hold back. Violet woke up, and she's crying because you're not there." Mac knelt down, ignoring the pain that shot through his injured arms, and hugged the small girl. The scent of smoke in her hair had been replaced by children's shampoo, though he could still see smudges of soot that a quick scrub hadn't removed. "I'm sorry, Princess. The police needed to talk to me for a bit." "Daddy?" Lily finally noticed Sterling, but she didn't let go of Mac's hand. Her green eyes, identical to her sister's, sparkled with restrained tears. "Mac saved us. He climbed into the car when it was on fire and got me and Violet out. He's a hero, like in the movies." Sterling looked from his daughter to Mac, his expression shifting subtly. There was still distrust there, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, perhaps, or the beginning of a reevaluation. Clara seized the moment to step forward, her young face creased with concern. "Mr. Sterling, your other daughter is asking for Mac as well. The doctors think it would be good for them to have a familiar presence right now, the trauma from the accident." She trailed off when she realized all eyes were on her, blushing slightly. Richard Rick Sterling was known in the business world for his corporate empire, built on cold, calculated decisions that made him a billionaire before 40. His photo often appeared in business magazines, always in well-crafted poses projecting power and control. But at that moment, watching his small daughter clinging to the hand of the taxi driver who saved her, he was just a frightened father trying to understand a situation that had spiraled out of his control. "Let's go see your sister," he said at last, his voice gentler. Then, to Mac, "all of us." The room they were taken to occupied the entire west wing of the floor, with a panoramic view of the hospital garden. Dawnlight was beginning to tint the horizon pink and gold, casting soft shadows on the high-tech medical equipment surrounding the bed where Violet sat. The little girl clutched a teddy bear. Mac noticed the hospital's logo on its paw, likely part of a program for child patients. Her eyes, identical to her sister's, lit up when she saw him enter. "You came back?" she exclaimed, stretching her arms toward him. Her voice was raspy, probably from inhaling smoke. Mac approached the bed, Lily still holding his hand. Sterling watched from the doorway, his face an unreadable mask of conflicting emotions. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" Mac asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. He noticed she also had a bandage on her forehead, mirroring her sister's. "My head hurts," she answered honestly, "but Nurse Clara said it's normal after hitting it." "You're hurt, too," she pointed at his bandaged arms, her expression more worried than a typical 4-year-old's. "These? They're nothing," he forced a casual smile. "I've had worse scrapes cleaning my taxi." The two girls giggled, and the sound of their laughter seemed to lighten the tension in the room. Lily climbed onto the bed to join her sister, and the two immediately started whispering to each other, occasionally glancing at Mac and their father. Sterling approached slowly, as if afraid to break the bubble of normalcy that had formed. "Lily, Violet, the doctor says you need to rest a bit." "Is Mac staying?" Lily immediately asked, squeezing her sister's hand. Sterling looked at Mac for a long moment. Something changed in his eyes. The fear and suspicion were still there, but now there was also something deeper, more human. "Mr. McAllister," he said formally, "may I speak with you in the hallway?" Mac nodded, promising the girls he'd be right back. In the corridor, morning light was stronger now, revealing how exhausted Sterling looked. The richest man in the city seemed to struggle for words, something Mac suspected wasn't common for him. The Sterling mansion rose against the late afternoon sky like a modern castle, its sleek lines of marble and glass reflecting the day's last rays of sunlight. Mac watched the imposing structure through the limousine window Rick had sent to pick him up, feeling more out of place than ever in his single suit, bought 3 years ago for Sarah's funeral, and now looking even more outdated. The driver, a middle-aged man with a military bearing who introduced himself only as Walter, had arrived punctually at 7 that evening at Mac's tiny apartment. Mac could still feel Mrs. Higgins's curious stare when he got into the luxurious vehicle, probably the first time a limo had ever parked on that narrow suburban street. "We've arrived, Mr. McAllister," Walter announced, pulling up smoothly to an ornate wrought-iron gate. The gate opened silently, revealing a driveway lined with meticulously trimmed century-old trees. The limousine glided over the immaculate gravel path, the stones making a soft sound under the tires. Mac took in the gardens stretching in all directions, perfectly manicured lawns, beds of exotic flowers, a marble fountain that looked straight out of a European palace. "Impressive, isn't it?" Walter remarked, noticing Mac's gaze. "But wait until you see the interior." Mac adjusted his tie for the 10th time since leaving home. The cheap fabric seemed to chafe his neck, a constant reminder of just how out of his element he was. In his pocket, the eviction notice felt like a ton of bricks. He'd brought it without really knowing why, maybe as a reminder of his reality. The limousine stopped at the foot of a marble staircase leading to the mansion's main entrance. Walter opened the door with the same deference he'd show any of the house's usual guests. "Good luck, sir," he said quietly, with a small smile that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Mac climbed the steps slowly, each footstep echoing in his ears. Columns of Italian marble rose on either side of the grand front door, a masterpiece of carved wood that probably cost more than his taxi. Before he could press the gilded doorbell, the door opened quietly. A woman in her 50s, her gray hair elegantly pinned in a bun, stood there to greet him. Her posture was perfect, and something in her dark eyes suggested very little escaped her notice. "Welcome to the Sterling residence," she said, her cultured voice carrying a slight British accent. "I'm Eleanor Ainsworth, the house manager. Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in the living room." The foyer was a study in architectural grandeur. The vaulted ceiling soared at least 2 stories high, decorated with frescoes reminiscent of Renaissance masters. A crystal chandelier that seemed to float in midair cast prisms of light across the polished marble floor. On the walls hung art pieces Mac vaguely recognized from his school days, a Renoir here, a Monet there, displayed with studied nonchalance. "This way, please," Eleanor indicated, her heels making a rhythmic sound on the floor. Mac followed, trying not to stare too obviously at the Persian rugs that looked like museum pieces, or the sculptures placed in niches along the walls. Every object seemed to tell a story of wealth and power accumulated over generations. Mac. The loud simultaneous call echoed in the foyer, breaking the solemn atmosphere. Lily and Violet appeared, running from a side hallway. They still had small bandages on their foreheads, but their faces were lit up with identical smiles. "Girls," Eleanor scolded, her tone stern but with a note of fondness, "what did we say about running in the house? And about proper behavior with guests?" "Let them be, Eleanor," a deep, amused voice said. Richard Sterling emerged from the same corridor the girls had come from, wearing a casual suit that probably cost more than Mac's entire rent debt. "They've spent the whole day talking about tonight." The twins happily ignored Eleanor's mild reprimand, each grabbing one of Mac's hands. Up close, he could see they wore matching blue dresses, their blonde hair braided in intricate plaits. "You have to see our room," exclaimed Lily. "And the library," Violet added. "And the butterfly garden, and the treehouse." "Girls," Rick gently interrupted, "Mac is our guest for dinner. I'm sure there'll be time to show him everything afterward." Something in the way he said afterward made Mac wonder how much of the evening was already planned out in the billionaire's mind. "Dinner will be served in 20 minutes, Eleanor informed. "Should I take the girls to get ready?" Rick nodded. "Please, Mac and I will have a drink in the living room first." The twins protested, but followed Eleanor after a firmer look from their father. Mac watched them ascend the grand, curved staircase, their giggles echoing in the formal setting. "Right this way," Rick indicated a set of double doors to the right. The living room was about the size of Mac's entire old apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the illuminated gardens, where the fountain he'd seen earlier danced with colored lights. A marble fireplace dominated one wall, large enough for a grown man to stand inside. Above it, an oil portrait showed a young, beautiful woman with the same green eyes as the twins. "Elizabeth," Rick said softly, noticing Mac's gaze. "My wife. She passed away during childbirth." "I'm sorry," Mac offered automatically, though the words felt inadequate. "Whiskey?" Rick asked, moving to a meticulously carved bar. "I have a 25-year-old Macallan I think you'll appreciate." "Yes, thank you," Mac accepted, seating himself in a leather armchair that probably cost more than his overdue rent. Rick poured 2 generous servings into crystal glasses that clinked softly as he placed them on a side table. "So, Mac," he began, settling into the opposite armchair, "how are your arms?" Mac unconsciously touched the bandages under his jacket sleeves. "Better, just superficial scrapes." "Scrapes you got saving my daughters," Rick noted, his eyes studying Mac intently. "You know, I did some digging on you after I left the hospital." Mac took a sip of the whiskey, letting it burn down his throat before replying, "I figured as much." "The detectives were wrong to suspect you," Rick went on, "but I understand why they did. Your financial situation, Mr. Sterling." "Rick, please." "Rick," Mac corrected, feeling uneasy. "You don't have to." "Dinner is served, sir," Eleanor announced from the door, saving Mac from finishing his sentence. The dining room was even more impressive than the living room. A massive mahogany table that could easily seat 50 dominated the space, though only 4 place settings were laid out, the fine china and silverware gleaming under a crystal chandelier. The twins were already seated, chatting animatedly with each other. Their eyes lit up when Mac entered, and he couldn't help but smile when he saw they'd saved a seat between them for him. "Your place is right there," Rick indicated with a smile, taking his seat at the head of the table. The first course was served, a cream of asparagus with truffles that probably cost more than what Mac used to spend on a week's groceries. Eleanor supervised the service with silent efficiency, her eyes occasionally studying Mac's interaction with the girls. "So, Mac," Rick began, after a few moments of quiet, broken only by the clink of cutlery, "tell us more about yourself." Mac hesitated, aware of the multiple pairs of eyes on him. "There's not much to tell, really. I've been a taxi driver for 15 years. Before that, I worked with my father in his mechanic shop." "And your family?" Rick asked softly. "I lost my parents a few years back, a car accident, ironically." Mac paused, fiddling with the silver spoon. "And my wife, Sarah." He felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "It's been 2 years." "I'm sorry," Rick said, genuine empathy in his voice. "How did she?" "Cancer," Mac answered, noticing Eleanor paused slightly as she poured the wine. "The experimental treatment was our last hope. It ate up all our savings and a few loans I'm still paying off." The twins, one on each side of Mac, listened in attentive silence, their little faces grave. "You have no other relatives?" Rick asked, his tone carefully neutral. "No, it was just me and Sarah." "Like us," Lily exclaimed suddenly. "Daddy said our mommy went to heaven when we were born." An awkward silence fell over the table. Eleanor quickly began serving the main course, a filet mignon that under different circumstances would have made Mac's mouth water. "You know," Rick said after a moment, setting his utensils aside, "losing Elizabeth was the hardest thing in my life. But the girls," he looked at his daughters affectionately, "they saved me, gave me a purpose." Mac nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Mac," Rick continued, his tone turning more formal, "I want to help you. Mr. Sterling." "Rick." "No, let me finish." Rick raised a hand. "You saved my daughters, risked your life for them without knowing who they were, without expecting anything in return. Let me clear your debts." Mac felt his face grow hot. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It was the solution to all his problems. But something inside him resisted. "I can't accept." "I also have another proposal," Rick continued, as though he hadn't heard. "Ever since the accident, I've been thinking a lot. I need a trusted driver for the girls, someone who actually cares about them, not just an employee doing a job." Mac looked at Lily and Violet, who watched him with hopeful eyes. In the few days since the accident, they had become surprisingly important to him, filling a void he hadn't realized could still be filled. "Please, Mac," Lily begged, grabbing his hand. "You promised you wouldn't go away," Violet added softly, her green eyes identical to her sister's, full of seriousness beyond her years. Mac felt something tighten in his chest again, the same feeling he'd had when he pulled them out of the burning car, a protective instinct, a deep desire to keep them safe. "I need to think," he finally said, his voice husky. "It's a lot to process." "Of course," Rick nodded sympathetically. "Take your time. But know the offer stands, both the job and the debt relief, independently of each other." The rest of the dinner was filled with lighter conversation, the twins excitedly telling school stories and making grand plans that always included Mac, while Eleanor observed everything with an expression that was part curiosity, part caution. Dessert, an artistic chocolate creation Mac almost felt guilty destroying, was served on the terrace. The night was pleasant, and the garden lights created an almost magical atmosphere. The twins, clearly getting sleepy despite their excitement, curled up on either side of Mac on a garden sofa while Rick watched them with a thoughtful smile. "They've grown attached to you," he commented quietly. "I've never seen them like this with anyone besides Eleanor." Mac looked at the girls, now dozing lightly against his shoulders. "They're special." "They are," Rick agreed, "and they need special people in their lives." He paused meaningfully. "Think about my offer, Mac. Not as charity, but as an opportunity for all of us." When the limousine dropped him off at home later, Mac stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at his taxi, a companion of so many years, his last connection to his old life. The contrast between the two vehicles seemed a perfect symbol of the dilemma he faced. The decision weighing on him felt as overwhelming as the luxury of the Sterling mansion, crushing and intimidating. It would be easy to see Rick's offer as charity, as something that threatened his hard-earned independence. But there was something more, something in the twins' smiles, in the way they instinctively trusted him, in how his presence seemed to fill a void in that family's life. Mac pulled the crumpled eviction notice from his pocket, rereading the words that just days ago had seemed like a death sentence. Now that paper represented a crossroads in his life. On one side was his pride and independence, symbolized by the aging taxi parked by the curb. On the other, a chance to start anew, to be part of something bigger than himself. A night breeze ruffled the paper in his hands, carrying with it the faint scent of the Sterling gardens. For a moment, Mac thought he heard the girls' laughter echo in the night, but it was just his memory playing back moments from dinner. He slipped the notice back into his pocket and looked up at the starry sky, thinking of Sarah. What would she say if she were here? What advice would she give with that calm wisdom she always had? "I just need one night," he murmured to himself, climbing the stairs to his building. "One night to think." But in his heart, as he turned the key in his tiny apartment door, Mac was already beginning to suspect what his decision would be. Perhaps fate, in its mysterious wisdom, had bigger plans for a broke cab driver than simply vanishing into the night. Mac took one last look around his small apartment, now empty except for a few worn cardboard boxes holding his belongings. 3 days had passed since the dinner at the Sterling mansion, 3 days of intense reflection that led him to this. Moving day. The decision hadn't been easy. He spent the first night sleepless, listing pros and cons in his mind like restless shadows. The second night he drove his taxi around the city, visiting the places that marked his life with Sarah, the restaurant where they had their first date, the park where he proposed, the hospital where he lost her, as if seeking the past's permission to move on. It was on the third night that clarity came. Ironically, during a fair, an elderly woman he drove to the cemetery to visit her husband remarked as she got out of the car, "Sometimes life offers us second chances disguised as difficult choices." "All set, Mr. McAllister?" Walter, the Sterling driver, asked from the door. He'd insisted on helping with the move, bringing the family's van instead of the limousine. "Yes," Mac replied, picking up the last box, the one containing photos of Sarah, "and you can call me Mac." The ride to the mansion was quiet but comfortable. Walter occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror with an understanding look, as though he knew exactly the whirlwind of emotions Mac was feeling. "You know," Walter said as they neared the mansion gates, "it felt odd to me at first, too. I come from a simple background, like you. But the Sterlings, they have a way of making you feel like you're part of something bigger." The staff quarters were in a separate wing of the main house, but by Mac's standards, they were luxurious. His new room was larger than his entire old apartment, with a prime view of the gardens and furnishings fit for a five-star hotel. "Mr. Sterling insisted on having the room renovated for you," Eleanor informed him, her professional tone masking any personal opinion on the matter. "Breakfast is served at 6:30 a.m. in the staff kitchen. The girls need to be ready for school at 7:45. Mac nodded, absorbing the details as Eleanor continued rattling off rules and procedures. This was a whole new world, with protocols and expectations that had never been part of his reality as a taxi driver. "And Mac?" Eleanor paused at the door, her face softening slightly. "Welcome to the Sterling family." The first few weeks were a constant exercise in adaptation. Mac learned not only how to navigate the mansion's maze-like corridors, but also the complex social hierarchy among the staff. There were older employees like Eleanor and Walter who wore their years of loyalty like invisible badges. Others eyed him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. After all, he'd seemingly jumped several rungs of the usual ladder. The routine started early. Mac woke at 6, took a morning jog around the gardens, Rick's suggestion to familiarize himself with the property, then prepared for his first duty of the day, driving the twins to school. "Mac, guess what we're doing in class today?" was Lily's daily greeting, always the first down the stairs with Violet right behind. The girls' school was an elite institution on the outskirts of the city, attended by the children of high society. The first few times he parked among the Range Rovers and Mercedes belonging to other parents, Mac felt curious stares. The new Sterling driver was a topic of interest, especially after word got out about the dramatic rescue. "Is it true you ran into a burning car to save the twins?" one of the mothers asked one day, her tone hovering between admiration and suspicion. "I just did what anyone would," Mac replied, the same response he always gave. But it was at night that the most intriguing aspects of his new life appeared. The twins, usually cheerful and chatty by day, often woke with nightmares. "Mac," Violet's trembling voice reached him one night through the intercom in his room. "Can you come here?" He found them huddled together in Lily's bed, their eyes wide with fear. The same dream? They nodded. The car. "It was spinning again," Lily whispered, "but this time you didn't get there in time." Mac sat on the edge of the bed, as he had on many nights over the past weeks. "But I did get there, right? And I always will." It was during one of these nights he noticed something odd. Eleanor was in the hallway when he left the girls' room, and her reaction to seeing him was peculiar. She seemed nervous, almost afraid, and mumbled something about checking the windows before hurrying away. It wasn't the only time. Mac began noticing patterns, conversations that ended abruptly when he approached, meaningful glances exchanged among the older staff, the tension whenever the accident was mentioned. Walter was the most obvious. The veteran driver, usually so calm and composed, became visibly uncomfortable whenever talk of the accident came up. Once, when Mac mentioned the road conditions that night, Walter dropped his coffee cup, completely out of character. Rick also had his moments. More than once, Mac caught him in the office late at night, poring over what looked like accident reports. On one occasion, he heard an intense argument between Rick and someone on the phone. "I don't care what the report says," Rick's voice carried through the solid door. "That car was checked daily. Dave would never—" The voice trailed off when Eleanor appeared in the corridor, giving a look that was both a warning and a question. The twins, in their innocence, sometimes let slip comments that seemed like puzzle pieces of a bigger mystery. Uncle Dave always drove slowly, Violet mentioned one day while Mac was driving them to ballet class. He said safety comes first. And that night, he was going really fast, Lily added, frowning. It wasn't like Uncle Dave. Mac filed away every piece of information, every suspicious reaction, every conversation cut short. There was something bigger going on here, something everyone either knew or suspected but wouldn't openly talk about. His own position in the mansion was a study in contrasts. To the twins, he was a figure of absolute trust, almost a second father. To Rick, he was the savior turned reliable ally. But to the rest of the household, particularly the older staff, he was an unknown variable, someone who had entered their lives through extraordinary and potentially dangerous circumstances. Eleanor especially seemed torn in her opinion of him. One moment, she was almost maternal, making sure he was adjusting well to the household routine. The next, he'd catch her watching him with a worried expression, as though afraid his presence might trigger something unwanted. Weeks turned into a month, and Mac found himself more integrated into the mansion's daily life. Mornings were filled with the twins' laughter, afternoons with lessons and activities, nights with bedtime stories and occasional nightmares. He learned each girl's preferences. Lily preferred orange juice at breakfast, while Violet only drank hot chocolate. He learned their fears. Lily was afraid of heights, Violet of the dark. He learned to be not just a driver, but a protector, a confidant, a constant presence in their lives. But he also learned to observe, to notice the little details that seemed out of place in this seemingly perfect world. Like how Walter always double-checked the brakes before any trip, how Eleanor kept a locked file in her office that she never mentioned, how the other staff sometimes exchanged worried looks when they thought no one was watching. One night, while taking his final walk through the gardens, a habit he'd developed since moving in, Mac paused near the fountain where he'd had his first serious conversation with Rick. The water danced under the lights, creating hypnotic patterns reminiscent of the flames on that fateful night. "There's more to this story," he murmured, watching his fragmented reflection in the water. "And I'm going to find out what it is." The sound of a window shutting on the upper floor made him look up. For a moment, he thought he saw Eleanor moving away from the office window, but when he looked again, the window was dark and still, as if nothing had happened. Mac returned to his room that night with more questions than answers. The luxury that surrounded him, a king-size bed, Egyptian cotton sheets, a marble bathroom, felt strangely inadequate given the mysteries he was beginning to sense. On his nightstand stood a photo of Sarah, smiling at him. Next to it, a recent photo of the twins, taken during a walk in the garden. Past and present, losses and gains, mysteries and revelations, all mixed in his new life, pieces of a puzzle he still couldn't fully assemble. But one thing was certain. Accepting Rick's offer had been only the first step in a much more complex journey than Mac had ever imagined. As sleep finally overtook him, he knew the Sterling Mansion's secrets were only beginning to reveal themselves. Outside, night wrapped the property in its dark embrace, keeping its mysteries for those courageous or destined to uncover them. And somewhere within the mansion's silent corridors, others also remained awake, guarding secrets that would soon begin to surface. The Sterling Mansion's garage was a climate-controlled automotive shrine, housing an impressive collection of luxury vehicles. On that particularly quiet morning, Mac was alone there, his footsteps echoing among the gleaming machines as he approached the empty space where the destroyed Audi R8 used to be. 2 weeks of careful observation had led him here. 2 weeks of gathering fragments of conversations, noting exchanged looks, cataloging suspicious behaviors. With most of the staff busy prepping for a weekend charity event, this was his chance to investigate more deeply. The maintenance office in the garage was locked, but Mac had borrowed the spare key from Eleanor's set during breakfast, a skill he developed in tougher years which he never thought he'd use again. The lock yielded silently. Inside, everything was meticulously organized, with labeled folders for each family vehicle. Mac quickly found the one he was looking for, R8, primary. Inside, page after page of detailed reports covered every aspect of the car's maintenance. "Let's see," he murmured, flipping through the documents. The last inspection was the morning of the accident. David Johnson, the deceased driver, was known for his obsession with safety. Every item was checked and signed off. Brakes, tires, steering, fuel, everything perfectly normal, except for one detail. The signature on the final report looked off. Subtle, but noticeable to someone who'd spent years examining passenger signatures. Mac compared it with earlier reports. Yes, there was definitely something wrong. Looking for something in particular? Mac almost dropped the files. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Eleanor, Take that," she said quickly, her eyes darting to check the corridor. "Not here. Meet me in the greenhouse in 10 minutes. And Mac," she hesitated, "be careful who might be watching." The greenhouse was a glass and green oasis at the back of the property, rarely visited except by the gardeners. Eleanor was already there when Mac arrived, feeding fish in a small indoor pond. "You're not as discreet as you think," she began without preamble. "I've seen you watching, asking questions, piecing things together. So you know something's wrong?" "I do," she sighed, finally turning to face him. "And you're not the first to notice." "Dave?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "He came to me the morning of the accident. He was upset, said he discovered something, and needed to talk to Rick urgently, but he never got the chance." "No," her voice shook slightly. "And now he's dead." Mac processed the information. "The report I found in the garage—" "Faked," Eleanor confirmed. Dave would never sign off on a report without personally doing the inspection. And that morning he was with me, discussing his suspicions. "Why didn't you tell the police?" "Because I have no concrete proof. And because," she lowered her voice, "I don't know who I can trust." Footsteps outside made them freeze, but it was just a gardener passing by. Eleanor waited for him to move on before speaking again. Dave found something in the company's financial records. Suspicious transfers, questionable contracts. He thought someone was siphoning off large sums of money. And that someone wanted to silence him, Mac concluded, by using the twins as a distraction. Eleanor agreed bitterly. Everyone would be so focused on the drama of their rescue that nobody would question the details of the accident too deeply. But they didn't count on a stubborn cab driver showing up at the right moment. No, she almost smiled. That definitely wasn't in their plan. "The girls," Mac began, "they mentioned that Dave was acting differently that night." "How so?" "Violet said he always drove slowly, that safety comes first. But that night, he was speeding." A child's voice finished. Eleanor and Mac turned sharply. Lily stood among the ferns, still in her school uniform. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "I forgot my science book," Lily replied, but her eyes stayed on Mac. Uncle Dave was different that night, Violet noticed first. "Different how, Lily?" Mac asked gently, crouching down to her level. "He didn't sing with us in the car. He always sang. And his hands. His hands. They were shaking," she demonstrated with her own fingers. "Violet asked if he was sick. He said everything was fine. But he was crying. I saw it in the mirror. Then he started driving really fast. And then—" Eleanor quickly hugged the girl, who had begun to cry. "It's okay, sweetheart. You were very brave to tell us this." Mac exchanged a meaningful look with Eleanor over Lily's head. Dave knew something was about to happen. He was scared, possibly forced into something against his will. "Lily," Mac asked softly. "Do you remember if Uncle Dave talked to anyone before you left that night?" The girl sniffled, thinking. He was on the phone. He seemed mad. Then a black car stopped near the gate, but it didn't come in. "Did you see who was in the car?" She shook her head. It was dark. But after the car left, Uncle Dave acted differently. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. A black car? Walter mentioned seeing an unfamiliar Lexus driving around the property that week. "We need to find out who was in that car," Max said. "The security cameras," Lily exclaimed suddenly. "Daddy always says the cameras see everything." Mac and Eleanor looked at each other again. The security footage. How had they not thought of it? "Lily, dear," Eleanor said, "this stays between us, okay? Think of it as a secret mission." The girl nodded solemnly, her eyes shining with the excitement of being part of a mission. "I'll take her to get a snack," Eleanor decided. "Meet me in the security room after everyone's asleep. Walter does his round at midnight, so we'll have about a 30-minute window between shifts." Mac agreed, his heart pounding at the thought of finally getting solid evidence. But as he watched Eleanor lead Lily away by the hand, a disturbing thought struck him. If their suspicions were correct, they were dealing with people willing to orchestrate an accident that almost killed 2 innocent children. The mansion at night was a different place. The normally bustling corridors became silent tunnels of shadow and moonlight. Mac waited until he heard Walter begin his final round before heading to the rendezvous. The security room was in the basement, next to the wine cellar. Eleanor was already there, drumming her fingers nervously on a now-cold cup of tea. "Walter just left," she whispered. "We have about 25 minutes until the next shift arrives." The security system was state-of-the-art, multiple monitors showing every angle of the property. Eleanor typed a password quickly, accessing the files from the night of the accident. "Dave insisted on upgrading the whole system 6 months ago," she explained, scrolling through the files. "Said we needed triple backup for everything." "He knew something was coming," Mac muttered. "Here," Eleanor pointed at one screen. 11:15 p.m., main gate. The footage showed exactly what Lily described. A black Lexus pulling up near the gate. The resolution was excellent. They could see Dave stepping out to speak with the driver. "Pause it," Max said. The camera captured Dave leaning down at the driver's window, his body language tense. "Can you zoom in?" Eleanor worked the controls, zooming in on the interior of the vehicle. The driver was partially visible, a middle-aged man wearing sunglasses, even at night. "Wait." Eleanor froze. "I know him. That's Arthur Jenkins from the company's finance department, the same department Dave was investigating. Exactly." And look, she advanced the video. After Dave went back inside, the Lexus didn't drive off immediately. Instead, the driver made a phone call. Seconds later, a second car, a plain sedan that would go unnoticed anywhere, pulled up briefly beside the Lexus. 2 cars, 2 people involved, Mac thought aloud. 3, Eleanor corrected, pointing to a shadow moving in the sedan's back seat. And look at the time the second car leaves, 11:47 p.m. "The same time I got the dispatch call for the Mulholland Drive ride," Mac noted, feeling a chill. "They were monitoring the area to make sure there would be no witnesses," Eleanor agreed. Except they didn't count on a taxi driver actually taking a fare that night, on that road. Eleanor began copying the files onto a flash drive. Dave must have left something else, I'm sure of it. He was too meticulous not to... A sound of footsteps in the hallway made them freeze. Eleanor quickly closed the video windows but left the flash drive transferring. "Someone's coming," Mac whispered. The steps grew louder. Eleanor glanced in panic at the flash drive. 89% done. A distraction, Mac decided quickly. "Give me your tea." As the footsteps reached the door, Mac pretended to stumble, spilling the tea on his arm and yelling in pain, a convincing performance helped by his still-healing burns from the rescue. The door opened to reveal Walter, who rushed in to help. "McAllister, you okay?" "Sorry," Mac moaned. I came to get some painkillers from Eleanor and ended up... Let me grab some ice. Eleanor seized the opportunity, discreetly removing the now complete flash drive. You shouldn't be down here at this hour, Walter frowned, though his tone showed concern more than suspicion. My fault, Eleanor returned with the ice. He was in so much pain, I thought I should help. Walter accepted the explanation, even offering to help Mac back to his room. On the way, Mac noticed the veteran driver seemed nervous, checking the shadows more often than usual. In his room, Mac waited an hour before using the private intercom Eleanor had discreetly installed a few days earlier. Were you able to watch the rest of the files? He asked when she picked up. Yes, Mac. It's worse than we imagined. Much worse. How so? Dave wasn't just looking into missing money. He found evidence of something bigger. Overpriced contracts, shell companies, even potential ties to political corruption. And it all points to... who? Not sure yet, but whoever it is has access at the highest levels of the company. The kind of access that lets them cover up a murder by making it look like an accident. Mac let that sink in. Are the twins still in danger? Probably not. They were just convenient, the perfect distraction. Nobody would question the details too closely when children are involved. The public outcry, sympathy for the family, all of it would divert attention from the real issues. What do we do now? Mac asked, his mind already planning the next steps. Eleanor hesitated. We move forward very carefully. Tomorrow I'll compile all the evidence, videos, documents Dave left, inconsistencies in the reports. But Mac? Yes, if there really is a conspiracy this big inside the company, we're dealing with people who have a lot to lose, people who've already proven they have no moral limits. Mac stood and walked to his window. Moonlight illuminated the mansion gardens, creating shadows that seemed to dance among the trees. Somewhere beyond these well-guarded walls, the real culprits behind Dave's death were likely sleeping soundly, protected by wealth and influence. I'll keep investigating quietly, he decided after a moment. Walter knows more than he lets on, and the twins themselves. Sometimes kids notice things we adults miss. Be extremely careful, Eleanor warned. Any slip could... I know, Mac interrupted gently. But I can't just ignore this, not after all we've uncovered. Why take such a risk? You barely knew Dave? Mac glanced at the two photos on his nightstand. Sarah smiling in their final summer, and the twins laughing in the garden, their joyous voices almost audible through the image. It's not just for Dave, he admitted. It's for them. Lily and Violet nearly died that night. They deserve to know it wasn't just an accident, that the death of someone they loved wasn't in vain. There was a long silence on the other end before Eleanor spoke again. You really care about them, don't you? More than I ever thought possible. Then be even more careful. They've already lost enough people. After Eleanor hung up, Max stayed awake, watching the shadows move across the gardens. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture far more sinister than he'd initially imagined. Tomorrow would be another day of outward normalcy. Driving the girls to school, smiling at the other staff, keeping up appearances. But now, every corridor held potential secrets. Every casual conversation might hide veiled threats. The night breeze rustled the curtains, carrying the scent of roses from the garden. Mac thought about how much his life had changed in the past months, from a bankrupt taxi driver to the guardian of potentially lethal secrets. I'll protect you, he murmured to the twins' photo, no matter the cost. Night stretched on, and with it grew the certainty that the real battle was only beginning, a silent battle fought in the shadows of a mansion hiding far too many secrets. And Mac, a former cabbie placed by fate in the right place at the right time, now stood at the center of a conspiracy far beyond a simple car crash. Outside, the trees whispered in the darkness, as if trying to warn him. Some secrets are too dangerous to be unveiled. But Mac had already crossed the point of no return. The truth, like the flames that night on Mulholland Drive, once ignited, could not be easily extinguished. And as sleep finally took him, one last certainty formed in his mind. Tomorrow would be the day to start figuring out how to share these discoveries with Rick. For now, in the shadows of the night, he and Eleanor were the sole guardians of a truth that could shake the very foundations of the Sterling Empire. It was just after 9 in the morning when Mac and Eleanor met in the hallway leading to Rick's office. The twins were already at school, and the mansion carried on its normal routine, unaware of what was about to happen. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" Eleanor asked nervously, adjusting the folder she held. Mac nodded. He'd rehearsed this moment dozens of times through yet another sleepless night. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. Rick's office occupied an entire wing on the second floor, overlooking the gardens. His secretary announced them over the intercom. "Mr. Sterling, Jake McAllister, and Eleanor Ainsworth are here. They say it's urgent." There was a pause before the response. "Send them in." Rick stood by the window when they entered, an untouched cup of coffee on his mahogany desk. His immaculate suit contrasted with the tired lines on his face. He'd been sleeping poorly ever since the accident. "Did something happen to the girls?" was his first question, concern evident in his voice. "No, sir," Eleanor replied quickly. "They're fine, but we need to show you something about the accident." Rick frowned, indicating the chairs in front of his desk. "Go on." Mac and Eleanor exchanged a look before she opened the folder and spread documents across the desk. "It started with some inconsistencies Mac noticed," Eleanor explained, her professional tone belying her nervousness, the maintenance report on the car that day. As they presented the evidence, the forged signature, the camera footage, Dave's odd behavior, Rick's expression went from skeptical to confused, to understanding, and finally to something Mac had never seen on his face before. Pure fear. "Stop!" Rick raised his hand as Eleanor started explaining the suspicious money transfers. He stood abruptly, walking to the bar in the corner of his office. He poured himself a whiskey, downed it in one gulp, then turned to face them. "You're telling me Dave's death, that the accident with my daughters, was planned?" "Yes, sir," Mac answered, "and whoever planned it had access to the top levels of the company." Rick returned to his chair, collapsing into it as though his legs could no longer hold him. Dave. He was acting strange that week. He must have found something. "He uncovered evidence of substantial embezzlement," Eleanor explained gently. "Bloated contracts, shell companies." And instead of coming straight to me, Rick ran a hand over his face, looking years older in minutes. "He was going to that day," Mac interjected, "but someone found out. The video shows him confronted at the gate by Arthur Jenkins." "Art?" Rick's eyes widened in shock. "My CFO?" Eleanor played the video on her tablet. Rick watched it in silence, his features hardening as he witnessed the sequence of events leading up to the accident. "My daughters?" His voice cracked. "They used my daughters as a smokescreen." "The tragedy of the accident would divert any deeper investigation," Eleanor explained. "Nobody would question too much with 2 children involved." Rick stood again, but this time his posture was different. The vulnerability had morphed into a contained fury that made Mac understand how he'd built such a powerful empire. "Eleanor, get Walter. I want the entire house on lockdown. No one enters or leaves without my express authorization." He picked up the phone. "I'm calling our legal team and the police." "Mac?" "Yes, sir." "You know the city's streets? You have contacts from your taxi days?" "Some," Mac confirmed. "Use them. We need to trace Art's every move over the past few weeks. Where he's been, who he's met." "I've already started making some calls," Mac admitted. "I've got friends in hotels, restaurants, other cab drivers who work the financial district." Rick nodded in approval. "Good, very good." He paused, glancing again at the accident photos. "Why didn't you come to me earlier with this?" "We wanted to be certain," Eleanor replied, "and we were trying to spare the girls more trauma." The mention of his daughters hit Rick like a punch. He walked to the window again, gazing at the gardens where Lily and Violet used to play. "They trust you both," he said finally. "Especially you, Mac. After the accident, I've never seen them attach themselves so quickly to someone." "They are special," Mac replied simply. "They are," Rick agreed, his eyes glinting with determination. "And whoever had the nerve to involve my girls in this sick game is going to learn exactly what a father is willing to do to protect them." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The police arrived discreetly in unmarked cars to avoid drawing attention. Detective Miller and Davies, the same ones who had questioned Mac at the hospital, listened to the report with increasingly grave expressions. "We should have dug deeper," Miller admitted, reviewing the evidence. "But with the dramatic rescue of the girls—" "Exactly what they wanted," Davies concluded bitterly. Mac spent the rest of the day on phone calls and discreet meetings with old contacts. Years of driving a cab had given him access to an informal network of informants: doormen, valets, waiters, people who observed without being noticed. "Art's been showing up at a restaurant by the docks," an old taxi colleague informed him. "Always on Wednesdays, always with the same man." "Which man?" "Don't know the name, but he's a known figure. A politician, from what people say." Each piece of information was relayed to the investigators, who were building a bigger picture of the conspiracy. But it was Eleanor who found the most critical clue among the files Dave had hidden. "Look at this." She showed Mac a series of money transfers, all to the same offshore company, all personally authorized by Art. "But the company doesn't exist. It's just a front." The sound of doors opening downstairs cut her off. Children's voices echoed down the hallway. The twins were back from school. "How do we explain all this to them?" Eleanor whispered. Mac peered out the window as Lily and Violet climbed out of the car, their colorful backpacks and innocent smiles a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. Gently, he finally replied, very gently. Night fell on the Sterling mansion with an air of simmering tension. Discreet additional security was deployed, cameras rechecked, protocols reinforced. In the library, Rick remained with lawyers and investigators, planning next steps. Mac did his final check of the corridors before retiring. He paused briefly at the twins' room where they slept peacefully, oblivious to the turmoil their home had become. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he promised in a low voice. "Not this time." In his own room, he reviewed the day's notes one more time. Tomorrow, the first phase of the operation would officially begin. The police had arrest warrants ready based on the evidence he and Eleanor had gathered. But as he prepared to sleep, Mac couldn't shake the feeling they were only scratching the surface of something much bigger. Arthur Jenkins was an important piece, yes, but was he truly the mastermind behind it all? The night wind carried the scent of the rose garden mixed with something else, the unmistakable smell of an approaching storm. Somewhere in the city, powerful people certainly already knew their scheme had been discovered. The question was, what would they do about it? "One step at a time," Mac murmured to himself, a habit he developed in his hardest days as a cab driver. Tomorrow would be the day the truth began to emerge publicly. But tonight, in the mansion shadows, the newly uncovered secrets were guarded like a locked vault, protecting not just evidence and documents, but above all, two little lives that had become the center of Mac's universe. The storm was coming, and this time they would be ready for it. It was Walter who brought the information that changed everything. "I just got a call from an old contact at the company," the veteran driver said, rushing into Rick's office, where he, Mac, and the detectives were reviewing their latest findings. "You need to see this." He set an old file on the desk. The paper was yellowed, but the Sterling Enterprises logo was still visible in the corner. "This is from 15 years ago," Walter explained, hands trembling slightly as he opened the folder from the dissolution of the partnership with Victor Sinclair. Rick visibly tensed at the mention of that name. "Victor. What does he have to do with this?" Everything, Walter replied, spreading out the documents. He never accepted the way the partnership ended. He vowed that one day— "Wait," Detective Davies interrupted. "Who is Victor Sinclair?" "My former business partner," Rick answered, his voice tinged with old bitterness. "We started the company together, but he changed. He began making questionable deals, threatening the company's reputation. I forced him out to save everything we built." "And he swore revenge," Mac concluded, beginning to understand. "But that was 15 years ago," Detective Miller objected. "Why now?" "Because now he had the right backing," Walter explained, pulling more documents from his folder. "Look here, Victor spent the last 5 years building connections with powerful people, including certain politicians who frequent that dockside restaurant where Arthur Jenkins had weekly meetings." Mac realized as the pieces fell into place. "Exactly," Walter confirmed. "Victor used art to set up his network within the company. The money-skimming scheme was just part of it. The real goal was always to destroy Rick in the worst possible way." "Using my own daughters," Rick said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. The phone on the desk rang, startling everyone. It was Eleanor. "Rick," her voice was urgent, "Victor Sinclair just passed through the main gate. He says he has a meeting with you." A heavy silence filled the office. Rick looked at the detectives, who were already moving into action. "Keep him busy," Miller ordered. "We'll position our teams." "What about the girls?" Mac asked immediately. "They're safe with me in the West Wing," Eleanor answered. "I've locked all the entrances." "Don't let him near this office," Mac said to Rick. "He could be armed." "No," Rick replied, a dangerous calm in his voice. "I want to look him in the eye when he's arrested. I want him to know exactly why he's finished." The following minutes were tense. Through the security cameras, they watched Victor ascend the main staircase. He looked just like his old photos in the dusty files, tall, elegant, with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Rick," he called jovially as he entered the office. "It's been a while, old friend?" Then he noticed the others in the room, and his smile faltered slightly. "Big meeting?" he asked, his right hand discreetly moving toward his suit pocket. "You could say that," Rick replied, keeping his voice steady. "We were just discussing some interesting documents." Victor's gaze swept the desk, settling on the old file. His face changed, almost imperceptibly, when he recognized it. "Ah," he said softly. "I see you've been digging into the past." "The past?" Rick rose slowly. "Like David Johnson's past? Or the future you tried to steal from my daughters?" Victor's smile vanished entirely. In one fluid motion, he pulled a pistol from his pocket. "You shouldn't have gone there, Rick," he said icily. "Everything was perfectly planned. Art was the perfect scapegoat. But you and your meddling employees," he shot a venomous glare at Mac, "just couldn't leave it alone." "Like the crash that nearly killed my daughters?" Rick demanded, anger making his voice quiver. "They're 4 years old, Victor. 4. Collateral damage," Victor shrugged. "Nothing personal, just business." That was the last straw. Rick lunged, but Mac was faster. Years on the streets had taught him how to read people and anticipate moves. He tackled Rick at the exact moment Victor fired. The bullet flew harmlessly over their heads. Chaos erupted. Victor bolted for the door as the detectives drew their weapons. Mac didn't hesitate. He jumped up and gave chase. They raced down the main stairs, across the foyer, and into the garage. Victor was surprisingly quick for his age, but Mac knew every inch of the property after months living there. "He's heading to the east garage," he shouted into the radio Miller had given him. "He'll try to use the service exit." Victor reached a black Porsche, smashing the window with the pistol's handle. Mac sprinted to the nearest Audi, the same model as the one destroyed in the crash, ironically. "Mac?" Walter appeared, throwing him a set of keys. "Take mine, it's already prepped." The Audi roared to life under Mac's experienced hands. In the rearview mirror, he saw police cars arriving at the property. But this was his chance to finally get justice, not just for Lily and Violet, but for Dave, too. The chase spilled into the city streets. Victor drove like a man with nothing to lose, weaving between cars and ignoring red lights. But Mac wasn't an ordinary driver. His years as a cabbie had given him intimate knowledge of every street, shortcut, and quirk of local traffic. "He's heading for the docks," Mac relayed over the radio. "Probably has a boat waiting." "Copy that," Miller's voice crackled back. "Tactical teams en route. Maintain a safe distance. Do not risk yourself." But Mac knew they couldn't let Victor reach the pier. If he got on a boat, he could vanish for good. Rain began to pour, making the roads slick as mirrors. The Porsche skidded on a turn, nearly hitting a bus. Mac seized the momentary hesitation to close in. His radio came to life again, but this time it was Rick. "Mac," he said, "Eleanor just told me the girls are asking for you. They heard the shots." Mac's chest tightened. Lily and Violet, frightened again. No, this had to end today. Using his knowledge of the streets, he took a shortcut he knew existed between two warehouses. The Porsche was heading straight for the main road to the docks, if he could get there first. The Audi jumped over a makeshift ramp, landing side by side with the Porsche. Victor, taken by surprise, jerked his steering wheel sharply. In the heavy rain, the car couldn't recover. The Porsche flipped once, twice, 3 times, a terrible echo of the crash he had planned for the twins. When it finally stopped, it lay upside down, smoke billowing from the engine. Mac slammed the Audi's brakes and ran to the overturned car, heart hammering. Not far away, he could hear sirens approaching. Victor was alive, pinned by his seatbelt, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. His eyes locked on Mac. "You," he hissed. "That damn cab driver who ruined everything?" "No," Mac replied, making sure Victor was securely stuck until the police arrived. "You ruined yourself when you decided to involve 2 innocent kids in your revenge plan." Squad cars screeched to a halt, officers swarming the area. Miller and Davies reached them first, guns drawn. "He's pinned," Mac informed, stepping back to let the police handle it. "It's over." But as he watched them pull Victor from the wreck and cuff him, Mac knew some things were only beginning. Healing the betrayal, rebuilding trust, the process of recovery for everyone involved, especially 2 little girls who had seen more than they should at their age. His phone vibrated. A message from Eleanor. "They're asking if you can read them a bedtime story, like always." Mac smiled, feeling the weight of the last few days begin to lift. He took one last look at Victor being loaded into the police car and then climbed back into the Audi. It was time to go home. Time to read happy-ending stories to 2 little warriors who deserved nothing less. The rest, formal investigations, lawsuits, consequences, could wait until tomorrow. The rain began to ease as he passed back through the mansion gates. A faint rainbow formed on the horizon, as if nature itself wanted to symbolize the end of a storm and the start of brighter days. Mac parked the car and took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline of the chase dissipate. Somewhere inside the mansion, 2 small voices were probably already debating which story they wanted to hear tonight. For the first time since the accident, he knew he could promise them with absolute certainty that the nightmare was truly over. The courthouse was packed on the day of sentencing. Mac watched from the gallery as Victor Sinclair, once a powerful businessman, now clad in an orange jumpsuit, faced the consequences of his actions. For the crimes of conspiracy, attempted murder, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice, the judge pronounced, her voice echoing in the silent chamber. This court sentences the defendant to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Rick, seated beside Mac, exhaled audibly. It was the end of a dark chapter that had begun on that foggy night on Mulholland Drive. Arthur Jenkins and the other players had already made deals with the prosecution, revealing the full extent of the scheme in exchange for lighter sentences. "Is it really over?" Lily asked quietly from Mac's other side, her small hand clutching his. "Yes, Princess," he confirmed, smiling at her and Violet, who were following the proceedings with a maturity beyond their years. As they left the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters awaited them. The story of the cab driver who saved the Sterling heirs and then helped uncover a conspiracy had captured the public's imagination. "Mr. McAllister, how do you feel now that justice has been served?" "Mr. Sterling, is it true you plan to create a fund to help struggling taxi drivers?" Rick raised his hand for silence. "We'll make an official statement later. Right now, my family needs some privacy." On the ride back to the mansion, Mac watched in the rearview mirror as the twins dozed off in the back seat, worn out from an emotionally draining day. Rick also seemed lost in thought. "You know," Rick finally said, "I never really thanked you properly." "Sir." "Rick," he corrected with a smile. "After everything we've been through, I think we can drop the formalities." He paused, searching for words. "You didn't just save my daughters that night. You saved our family, over and over again. I just did what was right." "No," Rick shook his head. "You did much more, which is why I want you to stay. Permanently." Mac adjusted the rearview mirror, catching Rick's gaze. "What do you mean?" "As head of family security and transportation. The position's been vacant since—" He hesitated. "Well, you know, I can't think of anyone more qualified or trustworthy." Mac thought about his old life as a cabbie, lonely nights driving around the city, his small apartment now empty. Then he looked again at the twins sleeping peacefully in the back seat. "It would be an honor," he replied simply. The Sterling mansion had changed in the past few months. The atmosphere of excessive formality had given way to something warmer. The twins' laughter echoed more often through the halls, and even Eleanor seemed more at ease. "They needed this," the house manager remarked one afternoon, watching Mac play tag with the girls in the garden. "A father figure who can offer not just authority, but also affection." Mac and Eleanor had developed a close friendship since the investigation. She helped him adjust to his new position while he brought a different perspective to the mansion's security management. "Cameras matter," he explained during a staff meeting. "But what really makes a difference is knowing people, building trust, creating a community." That philosophy extended beyond the mansion's walls. Inspired by Mac's story, Rick created the New Path Foundation, a program to help taxi drivers and professional drivers in distress. "We want to give others the same chance fate gave me," Mac explained in a local newspaper interview, standing beside Rick at the project's launch. Wednesday afternoons became sacred in his schedule. That's when he volunteered at the foundation, listening to stories like his own and offering not just financial help, but hope. "You've changed this house," Rick told him one day, finding Mac in the office reviewing security reports. "You've changed all of us." "You've changed me too," Mac replied honestly. It was true. The bitter man who had lost everything, including hope, now had purpose, a family, and a place to belong. One particularly beautiful Sunday morning, Mac drove a Range Rover along Mulholland Drive, but this time there was no fog or danger, just bright sunshine and the cheerful singing of the twins in the back seat. "Faster, Mac!" Lily yelled enthusiastically. "Slower!" Eleanor teased from the passenger seat, though she was smiling as well. Rick, sitting between his daughters, looked younger and more relaxed than ever. The weight of betrayal and conspiracy finally lifted from his shoulders. They were on their way to a picnic, a new Sterling family tradition. Mac parked in the same spot where months earlier he'd rescued the twins from the flames. But now the place held a different meaning. "This is where our family really began," Rick said, helping lay out the picnic blanket. The twins ran around in the field, their laughter blending with birdsong. Eleanor organized the basket with her trademark efficiency, her eyes shining with affection as she watched. Mac stepped away a bit, observing the family that had become his. In his jacket pocket, his old wedding band now shared space with the mansion keys, not as a burden from the past, but as a reminder that love can take many forms. "Mac, come see what we found," Violet called, waving excitedly. He smiled, walking toward them. The sun shone over the mountain road, the same view that had once witnessed so much pain, now serving as a stage for pure joy. Life was funny like that. Sometimes you had to go through the darkest nights to find the brightest light. Mac had learned that the hard way. But now, watching Lily and Violet run toward him holding wildflowers, he knew every bit of pain had been worth it. "For you," they said in unison, offering him their makeshift bouquets. Mac knelt down to accept the gifts, his heart overflowing with love for these little ones fate had placed in his path. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was exactly the life he needed. "Thank you, my princesses," he said, pulling them into a hug. And there, under the bright blue sky of the mountains, surrounded by his new family, Jake Mac McAllister, ex-cab driver, reluctant hero, and now guardian of two precious little souls, finally found his true path. The journey had been long and full of dangerous curves, but destiny knew exactly where he needed to go. And now, at last, he was home.